Well, the honor is all mine. I really appreciate the invitation to come talk about my favorite subject, which is Michigan and the Civil War, because those are two of my favorite subjects, born and bred in Michigan. And I'll show you in a minute how far back my interest in the Civil War goes. I do appreciate you coming here tonight in these polar conditions. And there was a gentleman here in the front row with a tiger jacket on. He could be home watching the Tigers. So I'm very much on my toes tonight to try to give you a half-decent presentation and try to make it somewhat interesting. I was a lawyer. Don't hold that against me. Now I'm retired, so I'm back in the ranks of honest human beings. And I tried to give exciting and interesting presentations as a lawyer, but I think history is much more interesting than the typical legal argument. So hopefully I'll be historical and not too much legal tonight. Yes, the book Michigan and the Civil War, A Great and Bloody Sacrifice, was an award-winning book. Amazing, lightning can strike, because it was the first book that I had published. I got a call one day out of the blue from an acquisitions editor, he said, at the History Press in Charleston, South Carolina, which is pretty ironic since that's the place where the Civil War started, in Charleston Harbor. And he said, I've been following a blog you've been writing about Michigan and the Civil War. I think there's a book there. And I said, you're pulling my leg, of course, and this isn't a real call. No, this is legit. And I said, well, why do you think this topic would be interesting? And he said, and this is in 2010, the Civil War is hot right now. Okay, that's like 150 years after the war. It's still hot? Well, little did I know that over the next dozen years, it would really become hot, with people looking at our heritage, looking at the Confederacy and what it stood for, the whole question about monuments, and the 1619 Project, and we could go on and on. So the Civil War is very relevant today, just as it was in 2010, just as it was back in the 1860s. Anybody recognize what this is, besides my name? Well, exactly. This is from the bar or restaurant neon sign in New York City that was owned and run by the great heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey. So I'm glad that he gave me that opportunity to put my name in lights. This is a little shameless self-promotion. These are from some of the reviews of my books. And I'm trying to establish my bona fides here. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a trained historian. So why am I up here talking about the Civil War? Well, there's a few positive comments that have come in the press about these books. The one did receive an honor. And I recommend to you that you buy these books either through me or otherwise, because the proceeds do not go to me. They go into a nonprofit, a 501c3 called the Michigan Civil War Association, the MCWA. And that nonprofit, Michigan nonprofit, contributions are tax deductible. It's raising money to put a monument on a national battlefield park, and we'll get to that. So all the proceeds do not go into my pocket, into my retirement account. They go into that nonprofit for the purpose of this monument. So it's for a good cause. This really shows my bona fides. This shows how far back my interest in the Civil War goes. If you've been to the Manassas National Battlefield Park outside Washington, Manassas being the first major battle of the Civil War, this is the statue that's there of Stonewall Jackson. And it's a very famous statue. He looks like something out of a Marvel comic book or one of the more recent movies. He's very buff. He's been weightlifting. But it's an iconic statue, and It's on the National Park Service property, so I don't think it will come down anytime soon. But who's this little guy up there being posed? Yours truly. Now I have a couple questions about this. Where were my parents? How did I get up there? And did I have a seatbelt on or something? This doesn't look very safe. But there I am, probably at the age of 2, showing my interest in the Civil War, or at least the interest of those who took me there. 19 years later, at the age of 21, I'm back at that same statue. This is the summer of 1973, and I'm with this beautiful blonde, and she was captivating. She was learning how to fly. She was learning how to fly out of the Manassas airport. So I put 2 and 2 together and said, hey, how about if we go to the battlefield after your flying lesson? And she was gracious enough to go. And in the succeeding 50 years, she's gone to so many battlefields with me as my spouse. So Suzanne is the light of my life. And here we are, just after we met, on a Civil War battlefield in front of a Civil War monument. What could be more beautiful for somebody like myself? Michigan's role in the Civil War is second to none, really, I would argue. There was all kinds of ingenuity and resourcefulness that the state brought to bear on behalf of the Union side of the conflict, and a tremendous devotion to union. The Union is something we don't really hear much about these days. Union with a capital U. United States of America, we're very familiar with, but the idea of the Union was almost a mystical concept back in the 1800s. It was something that transcended people's daily lives. It was the basis for our life here in this country, that we were in a unique place with a unique constitution, a unique society, that also had some societal issues that had to be dealt with. But the Union was this mystic thing. And so when the Union was threatened, Michiganders really rose to the occasion. And one of the reasons is just a generation before the war began, it began in 1861, in 1835, Michigan adopted a constitution so it could become a state in the Union. But we didn't get in 1835. We didn't get in until 1837. The reason being there was this dispute over the Toledo Strip. We wanted Toledo because it was a very good port, and Ohio already had Toledo because they had drawn the line north of it. So a deal was cut, as things happen in politics, and instead of getting Toledo, we got this piece of property called the Upper Peninsula. And as it turned out, I think that really was a pretty good deal for both Ohio and Michigan. And so when we got in, we had to fight our way in. So 24 years later, when the war begins, Michiganders are very devoted to this concept of union, to being part of the United States of America. And they're not going to cotton to the fact that it might be split in two. We contributed a lot of resources, both human resources, agricultural resources. We were very rural, a farming state, and mineral resources, which we'll talk about. We sent nearly 1/2 of the eligible population into uniform, which is an amazing statistic. And at the end of the 4 years of fighting, the result was a united nation, one that now had eliminated slavery and that adopted 3 amendments to really advance the cause of equality of rights for all people. So a really amazing contribution by our state. If we look at something that I think really tells us the impact of the losses in the war, let's compare it to this recent pandemic. The latest statistic I saw is somewhere north of 42,000 Michiganders died of COVID between March of 2020 and recently, approximately. And if you look at how, and every one of those deaths I know are impactful. They were a person loved by another, a family member, a friend. So each of those 42,000 is not to be glossed over. Still, it's about 0.4% of the population of Michigan, of 10 million roughly. So 1 out of 239 people would have caught this disease and perished. In the Civil War, we sent 90,000 soldiers off, and 14,000 never came home. So 14,000 out of a population of 750,000 is 1.9%, or 1 out of 53. So if we think about the impact that COVID had on us recently as a society, and you'd read the newspaper or you watch the news, COVID deaths, they'd be talked about every night, every week, just that constant drumbeat of loss, of death. Imagine what it was like in the Civil War, where the impact proportionally was much greater. And then in terms of the soldier population, 90,000 go off to fight, and 14,000 do not come home. That's roughly 1 in 6 or 1 in 7. If we were to take those numbers and bring them to today in another way, 750,000 population, 90,000 soldiers, that's more than 10%. With a population of 10 million, that would mean we would have over 1 million of our citizens in uniform fighting today, if this was the comparable era, which is an amazing statistic. Think about how 1 million of us would not be here, we'd be in uniform at a battlefield somewhere. And of that million, 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 would not come home. That's over 140,000 deaths. So the impact of the contribution that Michigan made is really significant when you put it in those terms. Michigan's heritage was not one of slavery, although back in the days when the French controlled Michigan, that was a practice that was known. But the Northwest Ordinance that was passed by the Congress of the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, prohibited slavery in the Midwest, in Michigan. And in that 1835 Constitution that I mentioned, slavery was outlawed forever in Michigan. So our heritage was one of free soil, not slavery, not enslavement. In 1854, there was a gathering in Jackson where the Republican Party, which opposed the extension of slavery, it was something protected under the Constitution where it was, but there was an argument about whether it could be extended out to territories like Kansas and Nebraska and Utah and so forth. The Republican Party organized to prohibit, to prevent the spread of slavery into those territories, and it was founded here in Michigan. Wisconsin claims that they also did it, or they did it before us, but we know, well, what's Wisconsin really known for? Cheese, yeah. So cheese, I mean, they can't possibly have invented the Republican Party. In 1856, we had a Republican candidate run for governor who won. There also was a national Republican candidate, John C. Fremont. He lost, James Buchanan, but we see the difference between Michigan and nationally. We elect a Republican, an anti-slavery candidate, when the national candidate loses. 4 years later, Abraham Lincoln is elected president on the Republican platform. And here's the vote total in Michigan, an overwhelming vote for him, for that party platform. And the governor who's elected is a Republican by the name of Austin Blair from Jackson, someone who had been instrumental in launching the Republican Party. He serves for 2 terms. He does not run again in 1864. So he leaves office the 1st of January of 1865, and his efforts propel him into the reputation of the war governor. He is Michigan's war governor. And there are others in the north who are known as war governors, but no governor is known by that title more than Austin Blair. If you've been to Lansing, or if you go there and you come right up Michigan Avenue to the Capitol, you'll see a statue, a monument to an individual. It's to Austin Blair, the war governor. And he's the only individual on the Capitol grounds who has a monument. There are several other monuments, a couple to Michigan regiments, Civil War regiments, but Blair's the only individual on our state capitol grounds who has a monument. And he's 100% into the war effort, which is necessary because when the war begins, our National Guard, our militia, has about 1,200 soldiers, and the amount spent out of the budget is about $3,000. They don't have real good equipment, they don't have real good uniforms, and when the call comes out for volunteers to join the U.S. Army and fight on behalf of the Union against this secessionist cause, Michigan has to raise regiments, has to raise money. Our budget has nothing in it. It's practically broke. So Governor Blair is key to leading the effort to raise money, to raise soldiers, and he does that for 4 years. We end up with 45 regiments of infantry, of cavalry, of artillery. We have a engineers and mechanics regiment, which is sort of like a construction battalion, the CBs that you may have heard about in World War II. And we also have a colored regiment, the Michigan 1st Colored Regiment, which goes into U.S. service as the 102nd Regiment. We have camps of instruction where soldiers gather, are trained, and then mustered into the Army all across the state, from the west side to the east side, from Fort Wayne all the way over to Grand Rapids. Oh, I forgot to mention one other interesting regiment, which is a company of Native Americans who are in a sharpshooters regiment, Michigan sharpshooters. So we have a diverse soldiery, and we have 45 regiments totaling some 90,000 soldiers. A few years ago, we had this conflict over in the Mideast, and we had succeeded militarily for a while, and then things were turning south. So our military came up with this idea that we would have a surge, and we would go on the counterattack to try to take control back from the militants who were wresting control of the situation from us. So you may remember that idea, that concept of the surge. Well, in the Civil War, there was kind of the same thing, because soldiers initially enlisted for 90 days, but right afterwards, it was seen that the war was going to take a long time. So their term of enlistment was usually 3 years. Well, here comes the middle of 1864. Those 3-year terms are expiring, and soldiers can go home. They've done their duty. They don't have to re-enlist. There's no requirement. They can't be drafted. But many of them do re-enlist. And so that is a huge factor in the final outcome of the war, because the northern resources continue to roll forward while the Confederate resources grow slimmer and dimmer over time. So that's a really key part of Michigan's contributions. We had a lot of prominent military leaders and actions. I call it military boldness. At Manassas, where you saw the statue, our 1st regiment, the 1st Michigan Infantry Regiment, made the furthest incursion into the enemy lines. And at First Bull Run, they almost produced a victory, except that Confederate reinforcements arrived in the nick of time, and the commander of that regiment, Orlando Wilcox from Detroit, was actually wounded and captured. So he became a prisoner of war right when the war began, and was in a Confederate prison for a number of months. Michiganders could then see right away what this war is all about. It's not going to be like a movie set. It's not going to be all glory. There's going to be some ugliness, death, wounding, capture, and Wilcox is a prime example. In 1862, in September, the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee moved out of Virginia into Maryland. This was a very significant thing. It was an invasion of the North. And his ultimate goal was probably into Pennsylvania. But he only got so far as Maryland because of some things happened. And one key thing that happened was one of his orders, in which he directed his various troops to disperse in different directions to accomplish certain objectives, a copy of that order was lost, which would be fine if it hadn't been found, but it was found, and it passed up through the Union chain of command, and it came into the hands of this staffer named Samuel Pittman. And Sam Pittman was from Detroit. He is probably the most important individual in the Civil War because he was able to authenticate this captured order where Lee's arrangements for all his various constituent troops are laid out, and therefore the Union Army could take advantage of that intelligence and aggressively move forward, knowing that it had a chance to piecemeal these different Confederate units. Well, how did Sam Pittman know? How could he authenticate this order? Because in pre-war Detroit, he had been a teller in a bank, which is really more of a significant term back then. He wasn't just at a window, cashing checks. He was a bank official. And one of the accounts at that bank was the U.S. Army's accounts in Detroit. So he got very familiar with the soldier, the officer who signed those warrants for checks to be drawn on the U.S. Treasury, a guy by the name of Robert Chilton. So of all the people in the entire Union Army that could have had this order come into their possession, it came into Samuel Pittman's hands. And he was able to say, yeah, that's Chilton's signature. This is genuine. This is authentic. He was the staffer for another Detroiter, General Alpheus Starkey Williams. And Williams didn't hesitate. He didn't doubt his aide. He didn't question him. He didn't make him, swear in a stack of Bibles or something. He immediately wrote a note to his commander, George McClellan, saying, "This is the real deal." And within a few hours, McClellan was moving out his army, and what resulted was the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862. That battle resulted in Lee having to withdraw back into Virginia, not moving forward into Pennsylvania. And it gave President Lincoln something very important. He was waiting for a Union victory so he could issue a proclamation of emancipation. The battle occurs on the 17th. 5 days later, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So from this lost order through Samuel Pittman's hands into Alpheus Williams to Abraham Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, I argue, is a direct chain of events. But for that would not have happened. Antietam is the bloodiest single day in American history. 23,000 casualties that one day from sunup to sundown. Now, I'm going to give you a hint of something later, but my wife and I went to Antietam a few years ago, and I asked the park ranger, "Tell me about the Michigan story here." And the answer was, there really isn't much of a story. This is before I really knew about Pittman and Williams and so forth. Oh, I went away. Oh, that's too bad. And I had this friend of mine. His name is Brian Egan. He works at the Henry Ford. He's probably the greatest living expert, certainly in Michigan, on Antietam. And he and I then did some research and wrote a book, a whole book, called Michigan at Antietam. In fact, not only did we write a whole book, but we had to lobby our publisher to expand the page numbers and the word count. And we had to cut stuff out. So this is part of our problem as Michiganders. We get no respect. All the way back to 1862, we don't get no respect. I sound like, what was that guy's name? Rodney something. And so our mission is to tell the story, the proud story of what our predecessors did, what our ancestors did to save the Union, save this country, and give us the democracy that we enjoy today. The 24th Michigan at Gettysburg suffered the greatest losses in one day of any regiment and helped push back, delay Lee's advance so that, if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, you know it's key. The key is taking the high ground at Gettysburg, the hills. And so the Union was able to maintain its position on those hills and ridges and fight off the Confederacy, producing another victory and what is traditionally called the high water mark of the Confederacy. And Michigan was there. Not only the 24th Michigan, but we had an entire brigade of horse soldiers. And again, we get no respect because when people go to Gettysburg, they go to the town and then they fan out, they go to Seminary Ridge and they see where the Confederates were, and they go to the Devil's Den and Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill, and you may have heard those terms, but people don't go necessarily to East Cavalry Field because that's further east. There's kind of a highway that goes around Gettysburg. It's east of the highway, so it's really so far remote, you know, why would anybody go out there? That's a beautiful site. It's farmland still, and there's a monument to our cavalry brigade commanded by George Armstrong Custer, one of the most courageous officers in the war. After the war, he has a run-in out west, and he meets his demise. But in the Civil War, he's an amazing story. And there's a statue to him down in Monroe. Controversial statue now because of the Indian War issue. I mentioned Williams, and then at the end of the war, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, flees. He leaves Richmond, trying to keep his government intact. He goes into North Carolina. He goes into South Carolina. He ends up in Georgia, where he's captured by a Michigan cavalry regiment. And one of the last casualties of the Civil War is of a 4th Michigan cavalryman. So if Davis had just done something honorable and surrendered, that soldier would have lived. But he's part of the story, the bloody sacrifice that Michigan made to win the war. There are some women in this group, and I'm really excited that you're here because you played a key role in the Civil War, one that traditionally is overlooked. Women were not allowed officially to put on a uniform and go fight. Nonetheless, there were some who did. And not only is it a fact, but some of them got pensions afterwards as veterans, proving that they actually were in uniform. But they couldn't traditionally, nominally do that, so they had to follow other roles. They served as nurses, they served as people in camp to help the soldiers with their meals and other things. Wives went to the front sometimes. Most could not, and so they stayed home, and they ran the house, ran the farm, ran the business. In World War II, we had this thing called, this idea of Rosie the Riveter. Well, they weren't riveting bombers out at Willow Run in 1863, 64, 65, but they were in industrial capacities helping the war machine. And that was the first time really in American history that they played a significant role. So, you have to admit, you cannot deny the fact that women played a key role in the war. Southern women played a key role in helping foment the idea that there should be a war, that the South should break away. And they were very dynamic on the part, most of them, that the Confederacy should be sustained. Well, Northern women met their match because they're the ones that ultimately triumphed. When I wrote the Civil War, the first book, Michigan and the Civil War, I made sure I had a chapter in that because many anthologies do not talk about this issue of what women did during the war. Since then, the most recent book, Heart in Tatters, it's a edited set of memoirs of a woman from Detroit named Eunice Tripler. And she grew up in Washington. She knew Andrew Jackson as a young person, the Marquis de Lafayette. She's almost like a Forrest Gump in a sense that here she is in Washington. It's a very small community, and she knows all these famous people. Her family is originally from Detroit, so they come back and they bring her as a teenager. She meets an Army doctor. He becomes the first medical director of the Army of the Potomac, the largest army in the Union, and serves during its first campaign. So her story is an amazing one. Sustaining him, she actually goes down to Washington to his office and helps him with his paperwork. She lobbies Abraham Lincoln. She lobbies on behalf of her husband with General McClellan. And when her husband dies in 1866, she spends basically the next 40 years trying to get justice for his memory. So that's an incredible story, Heart in Tatters. And I'm proud to say that I have another book coming out, which is a journal written by a mid-Michigan woman and her husband. Their letters back and forth. And that should be coming out maybe later this year or early next year. What's remarkable about these letters is that hers are saved, because most letters to the soldier disappear. They're not kept. They're lost, or the soldier just cannot maintain them in his kit. And so the letters home from soldiers are typically saved. But hers are saved. And in 1880, roughly, she takes all those letters, and they must be falling apart and about to disappear. She hand copies them into a journal. And that journal's in a library, and that journal will be published very soon, telling the story of this young mother. She's got 2 young kids, left all alone in mid-Michigan, out in the boonies, and how she copes with her husband being gone. And they're writing back and forth. It's like reading emails, very intimate, very personal, and very powerful. So I encourage you to stay tuned to when that comes out. Again, women playing a very important role. Here's a broadside from Detroit that shows one of the key things that women did in their communities. They formed these aid societies. They collected foodstuffs and made clothes and sent these off to the front. And it wasn't just that they did the work, they also did the organization and the administration. It was an all-woman, basically, thing. So here you have Valeria Campbell signing this, telling women, hey, let's work together on behalf of our soldiers. Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, contributed substantially to the war effort by producing a greater amount of iron to go into weapons and ships and so forth. And so you see here, before the war, we had 3 mines up there, and it produced less than 70,000 tons of iron ore. By the end of the war, we have 13 mines producing almost 300,000 tons. And so that part of the effort has to be acknowledged also. Without iron, you're not going to have ironclads. You're not going to have ships able to steam up and down rivers and off the Atlantic coast, defending our boundary against the Confederate privateers. So that is something that's very important. And actually, the Civil War helped develop the UP and put it on the path to becoming not just a rural, wooded area. Our political leadership, I already talked about Austin Blair, the war governor. One of our U.S. senators, Zachariah Chandler, he was a radical Republican in that he was 100% for winning the war and not sparing anything to do that. He was on the Committee for the Conduct of the War, which was an oversight committee, breathing down the neck of the Lincoln administration and the generals. They would call generals in and question them, how did you do this? What happened at this battle? Why didn't you do such and such? So there was a spotlight put on the Union military effort by this committee. We had two other governors, the one that predates Blair, Moses Wisner, who actually went into uniform as a soldier for Michigan, and Governor Crapo, who succeeded Blair and was just as dynamic on behalf of the war effort as Blair was. And our other U.S. Senator was Jacob M. Howard. Chandler is somewhat known. I think Howard is a complete unknown to even people who are very politically knowledgeable in terms of political history. But Howard had his fingers, his hands, his pen actually, on those three important amendments on and after the war's conclusion. The 13th, which eliminated slavery, the 14th, which established equal rights for all citizens, and the 15th, which gave the vote to African American males. So both of these senators were behind those amendments, and Michigan was very quick to adopt those, to approve those amendments to the Constitution. Again, showing the pro-liberty, anti-slavery culture that we had here. So let's talk a little bit about the war's over. It's a Union victory. Michigan can be proud. How did Michiganders commemorate the Civil War? In Campus Martius in Detroit, a Soldiers and Sailors Monument was erected and dedicated, I think it was in 1872, and at the top of it is this statue with the shield showing how Michigan, this is to represent Michigan, Michigan defended the Union, and one of our mottos is to war, which means I will defend. So that's the shield, to bore, and then the sword, obviously, to attack its enemies, our enemies. It's a fantastic monument. It's right in Campus Martius. It used to be set off to the side. It's been moved around a couple times, but it's right there. You go down and you want to go to the beach, you want to go ice skating, whatever you want to do at Campus Martius, it's there. It's central, really, to Detroit's downtown, our Civil War monument. This is a mortuary cannon at Antietam. It marks the spot where Major General Israel Richardson was wounded mortally at the Sunken Road, otherwise known as Bloody Lane. And he was leading an advance that took that position. Arguably, if he hadn't been wounded, he might have been able to lead his troops further into the Confederate position, and it might have resulted in an even greater victory. But he was wounded and died 2 weeks later. This cannon is right there at the epicenter of the Antietam battlefield, marking his sacrifice. This is a statue of Alpheus Williams. Anybody know where that's located? It's in Detroit, sort of. It's actually in the Detroit River. Well, not in the river. Belle Isle, yes. So if you go to Belle Isle, cross the bridge, you can go right over to Sunset Point, to the Scott Fountain, and you can wind your way over to it. Or you can immediately go left and go right down the middle of the island, and you will drive toward this monument. It was erected in the 1920s. Wow, that's a long time after the war's over. It took Detroiters, Michiganders, more than 50 years to erect this monument. And when Samuel Pittman was there to help dedicate it, he was driving in an automobile, riding in it. He wasn't driving. He was too old to drive. I don't know if he actually had a license, but he got to ride in a car to the dedication of this monument. Just amazing to think about how he had walked and rode in the Civil War, and now he's in a car. He's in a motor vehicle made in Detroit. It's an amazing statue. And if you look, when you're there, if you look closely, you can almost see Williams's face. Why is he looking down? Why isn't he looking up and forward? And, well, who knows what the artist had in mind, but I think it's to represent the fact that he never got his due. He's hanging his head, in effect, in sort of an act of humility that I just wasn't appreciated. He entered the war in August of 61 as a brigadier general. He served for 4 years. He was at the end. He marched in the Great March in Washington in May of 65. He was still a brigadier general, even though he'd been at Antietam and Gettysburg and on the March to the Sea and so forth. And he led not just a brigade, that's what a brigadier general is supposed to do, a brigade. He led a division and he led a corps. So he's really, I submit, and I wrote a book about him, our greatest Civil War general. And we do have a monument to him, so I encourage you to go visit that when you're down there. This is a marker at the Antietam National Cemetery showing that we have a Michigan section right here, number 18, where our honored dead are buried. Not too many people go to cemeteries at battlefields, but we all should, because that's where you really can get in touch with the notion that people bled and died here for our country. This is at Gettysburg. This is the marker that shows where the Michigan section is, and you can see it says 171 bodies. So just at that one cemetery, and that doesn't represent the total cost, there's 171 buried there. This is perhaps the most, I think, emotionally wrenching monument. This is the Michigan Memorial at the Andersonville prison site in Georgia. And you just can look at the figure to see the sorrow that is being represented because of the suffering that Michigan POWs endured in this prison camp. And if you know anything about Andersonville, it was horrendous. The conditions were horrendous. And I have not been there, but later this year I hope to take my wife and go see Andersonville. And I hope I remember to take a handkerchief. I've heard it's quite powerful. This is a grave of one of our Michigan African American soldiers, United States Colored Troop. This is the marker for one of our Native American soldiers with his real name, not his European name, Company K of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. And this is an amazing sight, I think, at Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit, because we have a USCT soldier right next to a 5th Michigan infantry soldier. European descent, African descent, buried side by side. There's no more powerful image, I think, about what the Civil War meant than this. That no matter where we come from, what our ethnicity, what our ancestral origins, and I have to talk about my wife here. She used to tell me she had grown up on the wrong side of the tracks down in Florida. As she's done genealogy, it turns out she's related to the kings and queens of Europe. She goes back to the Doomsday Book, one of her family lines, back across the English Channel, William the Conqueror, into Normandy. Meanwhile, the best I can do is a potato farmer from Ireland who came over here in the 1860s, and some Finnish ancestors who, oddly enough, came over so that they could escape oppression in Russia and settled in the UP. So is the Civil War relevant? Is our history relevant? Are our genealogy and our family stories relevant to today's events? I think so. This is a great image. If you go up north to Petoskey, Harbor Springs, Mackinac City, if you're observant, you're going to see this kind of Civil War era armament. And you have to be curious, because is that just a reproduction? Why is this in the city park in Petoskey? Well, it turns out that when a U.S. naval ship was being salvaged, one of our Michigan members of Congress was able to pull some levers and have the cannons off that ship sent to Michigan and dispersed within his congressional district up north. These are cannons off the USS Hartford, which is the flagship of Admiral David Farragut. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. The most famous Civil War naval person. And we have these artifacts up north in various parks. No one ever told me about these. I never read anything about them. I just happened to be walking through this park one day with my wife, yes, and there's a little plaque, and I thought, well, I'll just go over there and see, what firm reproduced this naval cannon. No, it's not a reproduction. It's off the Hartford. Amazing story. This is all around us. Why is our story ignored? And I guess we could ask that generally, but I mean about Michigan and the Civil War. Well, one reason is we have this problem in the Midwest. There's a whole scholarly field now trying to restore the attention on the Midwest and its culture and how it was really the heart of the American democratic experiment. Not the East, not the West, but the Midwest. And there's this scholarly neglect that has occurred that's trying to be rectified, and a ridicule. We're the Rust Belt. We're the flyover country. We're boring. We're cheeseheads. We're rivet heads. We're not, on the cutting edge of modern culture. Haute cuisine and couture and all this. Well, perhaps those are important, but no more important than all of our cultural roots in promoting, securing democracy, growing it, extending it to other groups. And so I think we have a Midwest problem. If Michigan was in New England, we'd be in a different boat. My Antietam story. How can a National Park Service ranger not know Michigan's role? I don't know, but just something that individual had not ever really thought about. There's the problem of Custer. If he had just quit in 1865 and started writing his memoirs and go on the talk circuit, go on late night TV and have a podcast, we would think of him as this great general, this courageous, almost death wish individual. Well, you see what happened in 1876. And so his reputation is not just unspotted, but has this complication. And even today, people are saying that monument down in Monroe ought to be taken down. The value we place on culture, and that's part of our problem. Do we really value our history? Obviously, you do, because you're here tonight. But in the great cosmic scheme of things, as a society here in Michigan, do we value our heritage? I think in a way we reached our pinnacle in 2001 when a certain governor and legislature created a cabinet-level department, history, arts, and libraries. We can only have a certain number of cabinet positions of departments under the Michigan Constitution. You can't have 100. You can only have 20. So to have one that was dedicated to history, arts, and libraries, that's very significant. That department lasted less than a decade when the next governor came in and abolished it. on the theory that we can't really afford that because of the economic situation we were in. Okay, what's the message? When times get a little tough, when the state budget gets crimped, what are we going to cut? We're going to cut culture. Because culture is, what is it? It's not essential. It's something that we can have or not have. This is the same governor, by the way, who closed the state fairgrounds, where we'd had the longest running state fair, where we had a pocket park that taught kids in Detroit how to fish and how to do archery. Closed that, again, because it was too costly. It was a $500,000 a year subsidy. Well, once we closed it, we had to safeguard it, because now we could have vandalism, and there were buildings in there, and we were going to redevelop it, so we didn't want it to be trashed. So we hired a private security firm at the cost of $1 million a year. So, okay, that doesn't seem to add up. So, where are we today? What do our political leaders, what do they think about our culture, our history? Are they 100% in favor of it? Do they support it? Do they fund it? When you look at all of the money that's being spent in Lansing for projects, how many of them are about history and culture? It'd be interesting to ask your local senator or representative or our current governor about these kinds of questions. So I think we as a society, as a citizenship, have to really step it up. But we have so many great things about our participation in the Civil War, and it doesn't just limit itself to that time period. Bruce Catton grew up in Petoskey, in the Benzonia area. He's the greatest Civil War author of all time. And just recently, 3 of his books were republished as part of the Library of America series. And what that library series tries to do is republish classic works, whether they're F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway or whomever. And they just did one on Bruce Catton, showing how he is the premier Civil War writer. David Blight, who was from Flint, he has written many books, including a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he is, I think, probably the premier author, historian, biographer of Frederick Douglass. And then Albert Kastel was a professor at Western Michigan University, I think it was, or Kalamazoo College, and he focused on the Western theater in the Civil War. And there's actually an award, book award, named for him, showing how important he was to Civil War scholarship. So again, just another little indication that Michigan Civil War and literaryism is very much up there at the top of the heap. What's the solution to this problem? Well, I put up our state motto. I can't pronounce it. I didn't take Latin in school. I chickened out. But what it basically means is, if you seek a pleasant peninsula, look around you, whether that's the Lower Peninsula or the Upper Peninsula or the Leelanau Peninsula or the Lost Peninsula or the Garden Peninsula or the Keweenaw Peninsula, on and on and on. Look around you. And I submit, if you were to look around you here in this part of Michigan, you're going to find lots of Civil War stuff. I live in Plymouth Township. In downtown Plymouth, we have our Veterans Memorial Park, dedicated to the memory of those who served our country, and I appreciate those who are here today who have served our country in uniform. Thank you very much. My father did, my grandfather did, 2 great uncles did, and I would not be standing here today if they hadn't done that. I might be speaking German, for all I know. So, look around you. In that park is a Civil War monument right in downtown Plymouth. So, these markers, these memorials, these reminders are all around us. We have to talk to public officials. What are you doing besides trying to get reelected? Are you helping our culture be preserved and enshrined. What have you done for that? And then what is the Michigan Civil War Association doing? We're trying to erect a monument to Michigan at Antietam. There is no monument there. There are several monuments at Gettysburg, at Shiloh, at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, but none at Antietam, where really the Civil War pivoted from just being to save the Union to also ending slavery in America. We have a book series which we are launching. The first one is Heart in Tatters. The second one will come out this fall about Dr. Tripler. I mentioned him. And we're going to try to do one every year. And we're going to try to make them collectible. This is a hardcover, preserved, preservation-friendly volume. All of these are only $20. They're affordable. They're accessible. And we're trying to carry on this story and balloon it out so that it's fulsome. And that's what, I guess, in my retirement I'm dedicated to doing. I'm trying to make up for all those years that I was a filthy lawyer, cheating and stealing on behalf of clients. It was all their fault. They made me do it. But no, seriously, I think this is something that each of us can really be proud of, our heritage here in Michigan. And if we're devoted to the notion of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, then I think we're in sync with this whole idea of what Michigan and the Civil War was all about. This is my website, and you can obtain books and information there. I have a Venmo account if you'd like to pay that way. I do take cash as well, but these books are for sale on Amazon, online, or here today, or directly through me. And again, all the proceeds go to support this 501c3, which is erecting this monument to Michigan's role in helping union and liberation. Thanks very much for your attention, and I appreciate it.